Last week we showed the refurbishing of a Pedersoli Brown Bess flintlock, and had a lot of people ask, well, you didn't show the refurbishing of the lock itself. So I'm going to take it apart again. It's in pretty good shape, but I'll show how it's done. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm making 18th century sandpaper. So I've pulverized some brick. I'm going to moisten this, and it's going to be the material that I'm going to use to burnish the parts inside the lock. There were a couple things I should have done when I did it the first go around, so I'm going to do it really right this time. This is going to give me a really aggressive grit using the pulverized brick. Another method they used would have been to mix clean white ash from the fire, and that'll give you a much less aggressive and a much higher polish on the parts if you wanted it. The reason for polishing the parts and keeping them polished inside of the lock is it will increase its speed. If you can reduce any of that friction, you're going to have a faster lock and you're going to have less misfires. So that's the objective for today. This kind of job on a lock could be done in the field if one had to, although most people, I believe, in that time period weren't trekking about with things like spring vices and assorted screwdrivers and such. And there's a lot of small parts in a lock, and you don't want to lose them. So I'm putting this rag down here to collect my parts. The bottom line is, if you've done this kind of work before a trek, a hunt, or heading into, say, a military campaign, the probability of your lock failing is really minimized. So anyway, let's get this guy apart. Most locks have 2 screws. There is the odd one that may have 1, and occasionally you'll even find one with 3. But the Bess has got 2. Pretty straightforward. So we're going to take off the 2 screws and take off the side plate and pop out the lock. I'm going to go to half cock on this. I think I went to full cock. Okay, I'm going to leave those screws in the side plate and set the musket aside, because we don't need that guy anymore. The first thing I do, and I'd highly recommend it, is remove the flint. They can give you an awful nasty wound that one doesn't need. I'm going to take this guy right apart, and we're going to clean up the threads in that again, although the last go around it cleaned up pretty good. And we'll go down to half cock again. So my main spring vise, it's got I think you can probably see that, it's got a bit of a bend in it. I should straighten that, but I'm going to see if it'll work. So when you're using a vise, you want the long arm on the longest part of the spring, and the base, the heel of the vise, you want it as close to the end of the upper part of the spring as possible. Now often a flintlock's just got a pin, but this particular lock has got an extra screw right here. So before we can remove that lock, we have to remove this screw. And there we have the main spring removed. And we'll take the tension off that while we do the rest of the process. The main spring is really strong, so I suspect, as I mentioned in the previous episode, that I think that's been replaced. And still got some of my grease in there. So the next step is to remove the shear spring. The next piece I'm taking off is the shank. And I put the screws back in each piece like I've done over here. I've got the screw in the shear spring, and I got the shear in the shank. And the next thing is the bridle. And the screw goes back in. So I'm removing the cock next. Now I'm going to need a punch to maybe. Sometimes I can get it without. That's the lock, or sorry, the cock, and the tumbler should fall out. So there's a difference between a well-made lock, one that's a precision-made lock. So if we call this the arc, if you could see a circle running off of that pivot point of the arm for the cock, the notches for the, this is the ease spring position. This is the half cock position. I'll get this little tool. This is the half cock position. Here's the full cock position. If we were to draw an arc around the tumbler, like so, this notch should be 90 degrees to that arc. If it's too far back, if it's back on an angle like this, it's either not safe on full cock, or it simply won't latch and lock at full cock. If it's too far forward, the trigger pull is extremely heavy. So if that notch, and this notch looks really good without putting any gauges on it, that notch looks pretty much 90 degrees to the arc. And there's a number of things you can do to, these can be filed to shape, and sometimes the actual arm, this part, sometimes it has to be either shortened or changed in terms of making it work in this. So if this is good and you're still having difficulty, sometimes it's shortening the tip of this if it's too aggressive to click. Anyway, there's a number of ways you can do it. The bottom line is almost any flintlock will fire on occasion, but if you want reliability, if you want it to fire every time, you need a precision lock, and or you've got to tune it. So there are a number of ways you can tune it, as I've mentioned. The next thing that's really important when I'm going to use my homemade sandpaper is friction. So the more friction those moving parts have, the slower the lock's going to be. So we're going to burnish them up, and we're going to have a pretty quick lock here, I think, when we're done. So the last parts to remove are the frizzen spring. So we're going to use our main spring vise again. It doesn't take much to, you just basically got to get enough tension off the cam of the frizzen, and that will allow me to remove this screw. This is a classic example. You look at these screws of using poor screwdrivers. So in the past, these things have really been, all the screws are the same. They've been rather destroyed. I'm going to, before I put it all back together, I'm going to try to file some of them out and clean them up a little bit. But we'll get the frizzen off for now. And again, I'm going to put my part back where it belongs so I can find it and set it over with the rest. And the final step is to take the frizzen spring off. It's off, take off the tension, put my screw where it belongs, and put it over with the other parts. And now it's time for some cleaning. Another way to fine-tune a lock system, and it's quite crucial, especially if you use it for hunting, where you really count on that. You've only got one shot, and you're not going to get a second shot at a moose or a deer, is the fit of the floor of the top plate of the flash pan and the bottom of the frizzen face. And when I put these together and I look out through this beautiful light I'm working with here, I can see daylight right through there. So it's a really poor fit there. Now this gun is fired literally thousands of rounds. As I mentioned in the first episode, it's 32 years old, I believe. So there's a lot of pitting here, but it's more than that. This is going to take some filing to get this really fine-tuned. When you're filing it, this file obviously isn't adequate, but you want to make sure when you're filing these surfaces that you're not rocking the file, because you're just going to exaggerate the problem. And the only true way to get a fit here is to use transfer color. No, they didn't have transfer color in 1750, but they did have the soot from a candle that one can blacken it. Put your face on, look where your high points are, work on them, and get that proper fit. While I'm talking about frizzens, often at reenactments, people are having problems, and there's often a blacksmith there, and they'll go to the blacksmith and they say, darn thing isn't sparking, can you harden that for me? He'll do a skate test with a file. I don't have one here to do it with, I do actually. And a file shouldn't cut on that. You can hear the sound. That file's skating on that. So I'm thinking 4140. It's a pretty high carbon steel. That thing's probably never going to need rehardening. In fact, you could use that gun until you could almost see daylight through that, and it's still going to spark because it's good quality steel. So often it's the relationship between that mainspring. Let's say the mainspring's really fast and the frizzen spring's really, really weak. When the cock comes down and the flint strikes the frizzen, throwing it forward, if there's not enough tension on that frizzen spring, it just flips it forward and you get no spark. If the frizzen spring is really strong, and let's say the mainspring is really weak, so you've got a weak mainspring and a strong frizzen spring, the cock's going to come down and it's going to hit that frizzen, and it's only going to partially open it because it doesn't have enough oomph, and it sort of stalls the whole process. And again, you don't get spark. So those are some things to think about when you're tuning a lock. One other thing I could mention too, and I checked this one, the frizzen, top of the frizzen, or the bottom of the frizzen, the plate that matches with the actual flash pan, it can't, when it's in position, springs in place, you should check that there's not an overlap of the edge of the frizzen to the bolster. If there is, that's got to be filed back. And again, be very careful that you're not rockering your hands as you're filing that surface right there. Burnishing the mainsprings, or any of the springs for that matter, isn't that important, other than you don't want them to rust. The real parts you have to focus on are the moving parts of the lock. So that should be adequate for that. Okay, parts are burnished. Back to reassembling. When you're putting the frizzen spring in, most of them have a post that has to align with that hole. When you're reassembling it, put a little tension on it. Replace the frizzen. This screw I'm putting in at this point should be snug, but it shouldn't be tight. You don't want to put undue pressure on the frizzen. There will always be some wiggle in a frizzen this way, wiggle wobble. That's not really that important once the tension of the spring comes back on it. So take the tension off the spring and try the frizzen. That's good. So I'm oiling the parts as I'm going, and I'm using traditional bear oil. And again, a shout out to my friend Bob Miller. He's one of the few fellows in my neck of the woods that's an avid historian and a great researcher, and I'm always gleaning information from him. But the coup de grace, he supplies me with bear fat and bear oil. So we're going to generously lube all our parts here that we're going to put back on the musket, or back on the lock. A little oil where the threads are going to go. Lots of bear oil. This oil is so pure you could actually cook with it. It's odorless, and it simply won't rust if you keep a good layer of this on the musket. Done. That is fully assembled, full cock secured. Actually, it's an excellent fit. Half cock, ease springs. Okay, a little more lube back in the gun, and we'll see if the thing sparks. One shouldn't over tighten the side plate screws. What happens over time, if you continue to take your musket apart, which you should do to clean it, you'll start to actually torque the face, the inside face, and the bolster will start to cock itself like this, and you don't need to over tighten these. That'll avoid that happening. Perfect. Okay, gotta get a flint in it, and we'll see how it sparks. That's a good spark. Okay, the frizzen's stalling a bit. So we're going to try to back this guy out just a little bit. Try that. Still stalling on me. Okay, I think the problem is my flint is a bit on the short side for this size of lock. Yup. And that throws one heck of a shower of sparks. Yup. That's going to work. Yeah, I've taken that old lock and made it into as quick as it was when it was built. So another thing I did, I spent quite a bit of time working on the base, the lip around the flash pan as it marries the bottom of the frizzen, and I got a pretty good fit. there. One thing I do when I'm hunting, if it's humid at all, I'll take a bit of bear fat, not the bear oil I've been using for lubricant, but actual fat, rendered fat, and I'll put a little bead of it around that, and then I'll prime it, and then I'll close that down, and that creates a really good seal between the two components. And you don't miss that one shot that you maybe the one and only shot you'll get that year. Anyway, I'm pretty pleased with how that turned out.